Good evening, everyone. I'm Kiki Jameson, President of the Fund for New Jersey. On behalf of the Fund and our co-sponsored partners, thank you for joining us tonight and welcome to the launch of Imagine More, Racial Justice Begins With Us. Well, this is an exciting moment in New Jersey's march toward equity, justice, and accountability. We know that these are challenging times for many across the world, and in particular, the people of Ukraine who are fighting for their survival. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge them and all people suffering through war and oppression. Tonight, our goal is to offer some hope in these difficult times. Imagine More is a first of its kind 6-part series of events that brings together national thought leaders, philanthropic and community-based organizations, policy advocates, jurists, and local activists from across the ideological spectrum, united around a singular purpose: advancing racial justice and repairing the harmful impacts of systemic racism. In conceiving this initiative, we began with a simple premise. Racial justice should not be controversial, nor should it be negotiable. Over the course of this series, you will hear from an incredible lineup of change makers who are imagining more, demanding more, and achieving more. They will offer action plans, practical strategies for making concrete changes in economics, criminal justice, housing, education, health, and political power. Imagine More will also connect you with the exceptional organizations that are moving the needle on racial justice so that you can take action in your own communities. Following each event, you will receive resources and information to guide you in leading change. So welcome to the first event, Eliminating the Racial Wealth Gap and Ending Poverty. We're delighted to present Andrea Mcchristian, Law and Policy Director at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Just today, the Institute released its report on New Jersey's staggering racial wealth gap, making the two New Jerseys one, closing the racial wealth gap in the Garden State. Andrea will help us to understand what we can do to repair this harm. Andrea will then be joined by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and Solomon Middleton Williams, Deputy Director at the Newark Community Street Team. Paulette Brown, the Institute Board Chair, will moderate an interactive discussion with tonight's speakers and will include questions from the audience. Now, it is my privilege to introduce our first speaker. Welcome, Andrea Mcchristian.
Good evening, and thank you, Kiki, for the kind introduction. It's my honor to open up the first event in the Imagine More speaker series, Eliminating the Racial Wealth Gap and Ending Poverty. I'm looking forward to a dynamic conversation and would like to thank the several co-sponsors of tonight's event, including the Fund for New Jersey, for bringing us all together. Let me begin with some remarks to frame tonight's powerful dialogue. $300,000. What investment could you make in your life with $300,000? Could you buy a home, pay off student loans, set up your children's college fund, start to plan for retirement? Well, here in New Jersey, $300,000 doesn't represent investment, but rather the opposite. This is so because here in New Jersey, the gap in wealth between Black and white families is over $300,000, one of the largest racial wealth gaps in the country. Indeed, New Jersey's racial wealth gap is larger than the nation's. In the Garden State, the median household wealth of white families is $322,500, compared with just $17,700 for Black families. And while New Jersey is one of the highest income and most expensive states in the country, 1 in 5 New Jersey households have incomes of less than $35,000 a year. There are truly 2 New Jerseys. But in this critical moment at the intersection of a nationwide racial reckoning and a pandemic that has disproportionately devastated New Jersey's communities of color, we have an urgent opportunity to repair the harm caused by this enormous racial divide. Today, the Institute released our new report, Making the Two New Jerseys One, Closing the $300,000 Racial Wealth Gap in the Garden State. In Making the Two New Jerseys One, we highlight several contributors to New Jersey's racial wealth gap, including how disparities in home ownership are a primary driver of the racial wealth gap. While the typical New Jersey Black family rents, the typical white family has over $130,000 in home equity. And how the racial wealth gap is fortified by job inequity, which we see through racial disparities in retirement benefits. We also outline how intergenerational wealth is a critical component of the racial wealth gap, with white families much more able to help their kids pay for college or help with the down payment on a home, ensuring that wealth stays in or out of families for generations along racial lines, in which I know many of us can attest to the impact student loan debt has on generating wealth, which again has a devastating impact on students of color. But importantly, in Making the Two New Jerseys One, we advance solutions that New Jersey can begin working on today to close the divide, including launching a well-financed baby bonds program, canceling student loan debt, and ensuring that Black homeowners are able to both buy homes and enjoy the fair value of their home's equity. And most critically, we highlight how we cannot have the conversation about New Jersey's racial wealth gap without saying a critical word: reparations. We must speak of reparations because the racial wealth gap and other stark racial disparities that have taken up residence here in New Jersey were not created overnight. They began with New Jersey's shameful history as a slave state of the North and the accumulation of property by white colonists at a time when enslaved Africans were deemed property. And they continued through exclusion of Black people from property ownership through racially restrictive covenants, redlining, rejection from the GI Bill, predatory lending practices, and more. And so we cannot begin to reckon with the racial disparities we see today, including New Jersey's shameful racial wealth gap, without naming this history and making meaningful investments in New Jersey's Black communities that have been devastated by it. And that means we must say the word reparations here in the Garden State. Now, our goal for everyone watching tonight is for you to both understand the extent of the racial wealth gap and poverty here in New Jersey and walk away with clear action items to close this divide and repair the harm caused by generations of divestment from New Jersey's Black communities. I'll now turn it over to Kiki Jameson, President of the Fund for New Jersey, to introduce our moderator, Institute Board Chair Paulette Brown, and my co-panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for those powerful remarks. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Paulette Brown, the chair of the board of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Paulette is a former partner at Loch Lord and municipal court judge. She was the first Black woman to serve as president of the American Bar Association, along with so many other achievements. Welcome, Paulette Brown.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening. So Kiki, I'm really pleased to be here, as I said, and with these most esteemed panelists. We've already met, and it's, I want to just back up a little bit because I want to say a word about what we're doing here today, and what a thrill it is for me to be a part of the kickoff of the Imagine More Racial Justice Begins With Us event series and moderate this important discussion on eliminating the racial wealth gap and ending poverty in New Jersey. And it's an important discussion because we want you to take away some things that you can do when you leave here tonight. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists who will lead us in tonight's discussion and offer us a rich wisdom. So we've already met Andrea Mcchristian, the dynamic Andrea Mcchristian, the law and policy director for the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Thanks for joining us, Andrea, and for providing us that critical state policy and advocacy context for our conversation. You always do such a stellar job. Also with us is Khalil Gibran Muhammad. Khalil is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School, where he directs the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. Welcome, Khalil. Rounding out our panel, and certainly no indication that because I'm naming him last, he is in any way least, is Solomon Middleton Williams, who is the Deputy Director of Newark Community Street Team. The NCST is a community-based violence reduction strategy that trains and deploys outreach workers and high-risk interventionalists in the South and West wards of Newark. Thank you so much for being here, Solomon. And so now we want to get right to it. We want to first ask Andrea, since she provided that powerful introduction, and I'm going to ask Andrea to just take the lead, but I want Khalil and Solomon to jump in on the response because we'd love to know your perspective as well. But the first question is many people mistakenly believe that racial injustice and wealth inequity is a thing of the past. But as Andrea's opening remarks articulated, it's simply not true. So can you elaborate a little bit more, Andrea, even though you gave that wonderful backdrop? Elaborate on the pervasive issues that continue to rob Black and Brown New Jerseyans of wealth and opportunity, and the top 3 policy solutions we can embrace right now.
Sure. Thanks so much for the question, Paula. I'm so glad to be here with this esteemed panel. So New Jersey was recently ranked as one of the states with the best quality of life, but we know that's not the reality for all New Jerseyans. Indeed, as we reported in our new report, Making the Two New Jerseys One, authored by my colleague Laura Sullivan, there are 2 New Jerseys, with many white communities on one hand able to benefit from the prosperity of the Garden State, while many in our state's Black and Brown communities are just scraping by. And as I mentioned, New Jersey is home to some of the worst racial disparities in the nation and one of the starkest racial wealth gaps in the country. But how did we get here? Well, to start, a substantial source of the extreme racial wealth gap we see in New Jersey today is the very high net worth of New Jersey white households. While the US median net worth of white households is about $170,000, in New Jersey, it's almost double that. And by contrast, Black people in New Jersey experience astoundingly high rates of poverty and financial insecurity, with about 30% of Black New Jersey households having no wealth at all. So what are some policy proposals we can do to fix this, to close this stark racial wealth gap? First, you can tell your legislators to pass A1579 S768, which will create a statewide baby bonds program to equalize the playing field for low wealth young people and give them the head start that their wealthier peers already have. You can go to the Institute's Action Center at njisj.org to complete an action alert that will let you text, email, and call your legislator to support this bill. Second, you can urge your legislators to pass A1519 S777, a fair appraisal law, which will increase penalties for those who discriminate in housing appraisals, with home ownership being a big driver of wealth and wealth accumulation. Again, we have an action alert on the Institute's website. And third, and a huge topic tonight, we need to say the word, reparations. And we really encourage everyone to visit 400yearsnj.org to urge your legislators to pass legislation creating a statewide reparations task force in New Jersey. And I'm excited to delve into the reparations conversation with this group tonight. Thank you.
So Solomon, what are your top 3 things policy solutions that we can think about, engage in, action to take?
Yeah, thank you, Paulette, for having us here today. And thank you, Andrea, for laying the foundation for the work here today and really looking and examining what reparations look like. You know, I have an honor to serve as the deputy director for the Newark Community Street Team, where we have 72 employees. And the reality is that out of the 72 employees, half of our staff are homeless, right? And this is because over incarceration of our Black and brown people. And so when we talk about policies, 3 recommendations, here are our 3 recommendations from a community stance. First, we must invest directly in community-based public safety initiatives that builds infrastructure and jobs in neighborhoods that are impacted by violence, right? This includes a really robust victim services unit. Second, we must decriminalize drugs, right? We must end the war on drugs. This is the longest war in America's history, is a war on Black and brown people. And the war on drugs is one of them. Third, we must have equal affordable housing, regardless of a person's criminal record. And the fourth, which is most important, which you'll hear me say tonight over and over and over, is that we must stop arresting Black and brown bodies.
You gave us a bonus policy. Thank you. Dr. Muhammad, tell us your thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, again, I'd like Solomon, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a great honor, Judge Brown, to meet you. And I'm a big fan of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice and Andrea's work in particular. So, I'm just going to try to play at the edges because I don't want to distract from the focus that the Institute has done to work with state legislators to really key in on some key points. I want to say really 2 things. One, I think that data and evidence and research are key to making the case and the storytelling and narrative change that we need to rally people to this cause. But I do want to acknowledge that the hole we're in is very deep. And we live in a post-fact world where alternative truths are driving, in many ways, the erosion of our democratic institutions. So I just want to acknowledge that as someone who's spent 25 years in the classroom educating people, that this is not easy work to do in order to present and make the case before the New Jersey public, before the American public. And that's important framing for why I'm going to propose some policy choices that I think are perhaps not the most obvious, nor perhaps the most shovel ready, but I think they should be part of our conceptualization of the work that's in front of us. So I'm going to really lean into this notion of reparations and echo Andrea's point, but we need a Truth and Reparations Commission. That is to say that we need the truth to be laid bare as a way of socializing all New Jerseyans and all Americans about what actually happened in this country and what has continued to happen right up to the very present. And that should lead to agreement on reparations as a cash payment to redress, as my colleagues at Harvard talk about, some form of compensatory reparations. In addition to that, I think that within a truth context, the state of New Jersey ought to pass a constitutional amendment to codify anti-bias education and truth and history laws. As we can see across many parts of the United States, states are doing just the opposite. And this is not a neutral issue. We can't just say we're not doing that and so we're okay. The Amistad Commission was a great first step many years ago, but it lacked enforcement provisions. It also lacked an awareness of the broader contours that this isn't just about celebrating Black excellence or Black agency or the contributions of Black people to the state. This is fundamentally about people who've been at the vanguard of protecting democracy and making this country actually function. And so we need constitutional protections that in the classroom we socialize all children in the state to understand actually who we are as a nation and what we can be and should be. Why is that important? Because when we play the policy sausage making, we create possibilities that can be quickly eroded with changes in political leadership and electoral politics. Just by way of a quick example, in 1965, shortly after the Civil Rights Act, it was actually Nixon as the next president after Johnson who put in place the Philadelphia Plan. Judge Brown, I know you know this history very well. The Philadelphia Plan was a blueprint for what became affirmative action. By 1978, let's call it 10 years later after Nixon was elected, the Supreme Court was chipping away at affirmative action. So if we don't change who we are as a people, which is what happens in our nation's classrooms, then we're going to be fighting these policy battles one generation to the next. The last 2 that I'll mention really just echo what Solomon already said. We have to end the war on crime and the war on drugs through decriminalization, decarceration, and rolling back the policy apparatus that gave us mass incarceration in the first place. It was a lot of little steps that were ultimately like a snowball avalanche into a giant mountain of punitiveness that really needs to be disentangled. And that's going to take a lot of work. Finally, I'll say as a twofer, education and housing are two sides of the kind of work we know works in every other community where investments are commensurate with what people need. Black communities don't get what they have. I would propose for education that we fund it at the state level, remove it from local property taxes, and we create a state with county level education systems. There are no exit ramps in county level systems for people to shift their children into one community or the other to avoid integration. And I think that's an important policy lever. Finally, on housing, we need to focus on zoning laws and other property credits where people are able, as developers, to outsource their requirements. This is a loophole that's long been in place, and it's time we put an end to it.
Great, thank you, Dr. Muhammad. And since you touched on a lot of points in our next question, which is, I think that one of the things we don't say enough is that racial justice should not be, nor is it controversial. It definitely should not be. So, your point about creating a constitutional amendment is really a good one with regard to education and repairing the harms created by centuries of racial injustice. In other words, reparations would not only help our country to be accountable or address these systemic injustices, but will ultimately benefit all of us. And, and if I could just say a word, reparations is not a new word, and it's not a word that's unique to Black people. It has been used in many other contexts for other people. So let's just put it out there. And so, so that's wealth inequity isn't just a Black and white issue. It affects the Latinx population. It affects the AAPI communities, women, immigrants, just to name a few. And, quite frankly, it affects, just poor people in general. Can you help us understand the positive economic and social impact of reparations on all of the Garden State? I know you don't live in the Garden State, but I know you're familiar with it. If you could just tell us, I know it's crazy, but maybe give us like your 30-second big picture of the impact of reparations, what it would do for New Jersey.
Well, the good news is I actually do live in New Jersey. I live in South Orange.
That's exactly right. I forgot that. I apologize. I apologize. I'm thinking where your work is as opposed to where you actually live. I did know that. Thank you for reminding me.
I'm a proud adopted New Jerseyan and a proud Rutgers alum. So let me say this. A lot of economists spend a lot of time crunching the numbers on the multiplier effect of the kinds of human capital investments that ultimately come with something like reparations. And there's been a lot of attention to this issue in the wake of George Floyd. A lot of banks have issued reports where they've made pledges, billion-dollar pledges to invest in the Black community. And the bottom line is, what we know is that the economy, unfortunately, my dog's deciding to bark right at this moment, the economy grows in direct proportion to the kind of investments that we're talking about in which reparations would bring. This is a non-starter. This benefits everyone. And just by way of quick example, and then I'll stop talking because I want Andrea and Solomon to talk more specifically about what they've done. The Great Depression that produced nationwide misery and inequality was solved by two factors: stimulus spending that ultimately was the New Deal, but most especially World War II and the massive amounts of money that went into building the war machinery that ultimately toppled Hitler, Germany, and Japan. And so we know that fiscal spending has a huge multiplier effect. The problem is that it was never directed towards Black, Brown, and AAPI communities like Chinese immigrants back in those days. And ultimately, we are still waiting for that kind of fiscal stimulus for our communities. The debt is not going to go away, and it's only going to accumulate. So now is not only just as good a time as any, but it's long overdue.
Great. Thank you, Andrea.
Sure, and I echo everything that President Muhammad just said, and I just want to also bring in a real life New Jersey example. And so to do that, I have to tell a story about the Bordentown School. So founded in 1886 by the formerly enslaved Reverend Walter Rice, the Bordentown School was a state-run boarding school in Bordentown, New Jersey for the state's Black students. Called the Tuskegee of the North After Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, the school educated generations of New Jersey's Black youth to become leaders in law, medicine, education, and other trades. Hailed as a national model, it was visited by W.E.B. Du Bois, Albert Einstein, and many others. After the end of school segregation and a failed attempt to integrate, the Bordentown School closed in 1955. And what now sits on the land that was once home to the Tuskegee of the North? Hayes, New Jersey's girls' youth prison. And across the street sits JMSF, the state's most secure youth prison for boys. Bordentown has literally become the school to prison pipeline realized. Now, instead of being #1 in Black education, we're #1 in the nation for having the worst Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in the country. And we spend almost $500,000 to incarcerate each of the 100 young people in our state's youth prisons, which are over 75% empty. In youth prisons that remove kids from their schools, their families, and their communities. This is a broken system in need of repair, and how do we make that repair? By recommitting to meaningful investments in Black communities, as we did with the Bordentown School that will repair the harm from generations of incarceration, generations of divestment, generations of denying Black New Jerseyans the ability to generate wealth, which has led to today's shameful racial wealth gap. New Jersey needs to say the word reparations to make Black communities whole that it has by design devastated. And a few years ago, I had the pleasure of walking the Bordentown School's grounds with Dr. Arthur Symes, an 80-year-old graduate of the school who went on to become Dean of Architecture at a university. Dr. Symes was almost moved to tears by seeing that his beloved institution, which had given him so much and invested in his life, was now a youth prison. He became overwhelmed at how New Jersey had chosen to honor this history, this Black history. And so when we think of reparations, I want us to think of Dr. Symes. I want us to think of the positive impact and investment in his future made on him, made on his community. And I want you to think about how New Jersey chose to honor that commitment by now investing in the source of Black youth's downfall. And so when we talk about reparations, I want you to think of the humans that it impacts. I want you to think of repair. I want you to think of generational harm. And that is why we need to say the word reparations.
Thank you. That was extremely powerful, as always. So, Mr. Middleton Williams, what say you on this issue?
Yeah, I appreciate, Khalil, really high level thinking, right? And then Andrea sharing, a really a story that we can relate to. So I just wanted to share a story as well, right? There's a story of a lady named Barbara Fisher, who happens to be my mother, and she had 15 children, right? And she unfortunately was a victim of the war on drugs. And my mother's story is not unique, right? This is a story that Black and brown families face today. And because she suffered from substance abuse, her 15 children were taken away from her, right? In return, two of her sons were murdered, right? They were victims of gun violence, right? Imagine if we had reparations in 1992 when I was taken away from my home, right? Imagine if we had financial, social, and emotional reparations, right? My mother would have 2 living sons, right? And that she wouldn't abuse drugs if she had the support. This is why we're calling for reparations. We're calling for repair. And again, my story isn't unique. I just choose to share it because there are many people here in the city of Newark, across the state of New Jersey, who share the common story. I would say, look, last year, New Jersey had a surplus of $10 billion, and we had an opportunity to do and support reparations, but we chose not to. This is why we got to continue to urge our lawmakers to do reparations. And so, I stand on the shoulders of 72 employees who have similar stories that I have. And we must do this in small doses to repair harm that has been done to the Black and brown community.
Small doses, you say? Can we do some small doses, some intermediate doses, and some big doses? At any of that, I think that this program needs to be a lot longer than the time that we've been allotted, because we are quickly, unfortunately, running out of time. And so I am going to skip to a question because I really want to make sure we get this question answered. And and by all of you, because I think that your perspective on this is just so important, and it's really important. But we want to have some time for the audience to ask some questions as well. So, the question I want to ask you is that our government needs to be held accountable. And Andrea, you talked some about that, and all of you did, in fact, talked about how our government needs to be held accountable, and a lot of the responsibility that they have for the current wealth gap and for so many other things that are bridges or steps or links to the wealth gap, including what you already talked about, the lack of housing, the fact of what happened as a result when we go back 400 years to slavery and all of the missed opportunities and what was taken from us as we built New Jersey. And so, our government needs to be held accountable and keep the promise of racial justice for all and equitable justice. But it's equally as important for all of us to recognize the power that we have as individuals and in our own organizations to put pressure on institutions and systems to address the racial wealth gap and end poverty. I would love to hear from each of you about what each person on this call can do today to advocate for the closing of the wealth gap, be that through reparations and how we can achieve racial equity on a local, state, and federal level. And so, it's the goal is to close the wealth gap. I can't stop saying reparations, it slipped right out. But how we can close the wealth gap. What can I do today? What can I do tomorrow? What can people on this call, on this webinar right now, what can they do as individuals to close this wealth gap? And it doesn't matter what you look like or who you are on this call. What can we do? Andrea, let's go with you first.
Sure, thanks, Paulette. So I think the first thing you can do is educate yourself. So I think it's a big step that you're all watching today. Something that Governor Murphy said this week, and I quote, is New Jersey's history is pretty awful. The last state to ratify the 13th Amendment, very significant slave trade among the weak players of the northern states, end quote. Well, actually, I want to disabuse us of the notion that New Jersey was a passive observer in slavery. We were called the slave state of the North. English settlers for the colony were given additional land allotments for every enslaved person they brought with them. We had an early form of sharecropping called cottaging that led to racially restrictive covenants, redlining, predatory lending, and foreclosure. So educate yourself. We have a report called Erasing New Jersey's Lines that traces this history. We have our Making the Two New Jerseys One report that just came out. Read reports, educate yourself about what actually the history of slavery and its legacy is in New Jersey. Second, we will urge you again to go to 400yearsnj.org, and that's how you can tweet, email, and call your legislators to create the statewide reparations task force. We had first introduced the reparations task force bill. California passed us to become the first state to actually get it in motion. And so we want to become the second. It's critical to make those meaningful investments. And third, have conversations. As you educate yourself, as you do advocacy, make sure you're talking to people around the table, your family, your neighbors, your congregation, to make sure that we build a broad-based coalition of racial and social justice advocates.
Great, thank you. Solomon.
Thank you. I think if we look at the color of law, right? If we read the book The Color of Law, and Richard describes like this is a system that was created, right, to do harm. And specifically, he was talking about housing, right? But I think it matters here as well when we talk about reparations. You talk about if this system was created by government, and then it should also be fixed, right? It can be fixed. And then he goes on to say, that we have an obligation to do so. And I think as the Black community, like we have an obligation to say what reparation looks like for our community, right? We have a chance to say right now, like, hey, we want restorative justice over incarceration, right? That we want mediation services, intervention services over incarceration, right? We want to be able to choose whatever deluxe apartment and whatever sky that we want to live in, right? Regardless of our criminal background, right? These are the things that we must advocate for. And furthermore, we must advocate, right, to end the horrific child support system that disenfranchises Black and brown men and women. And lastly, I would say, like, we must, and I keep saying this, but we must stop advocating to lock up our own kids. And so, that's the premises of how we can advocate. And right now, I want to say, the DEA just released February 1st, Operation Overdrive, as another initiative to lock up Black and brown kids. And we must protect our kids by telling our local government that we do not want the DEA in our communities to lock up Black and brown kids as a form of reparation.
Great. Thank you. And can you bring us home, Dr. Muhammad, on this question about what each of us as individuals can do?
Yeah. So I don't think I'm going to reinvent the wheel here, but I just want to put a little bit more context on what's already been said. I think Andrea is absolutely right. Education is key. Owning this for yourself. People tend to not appreciate the urgency of a matter unless they take the time to study the issue on their own terms. And so I just want to recommend two things, in addition to everything Andrea cited that the Institute has put online. Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. It really takes stock of some of the best scholarship around this. Solomon has already mentioned Richard Rothstein's work, of which Coates uses in that piece. So The Case for Reparations, Atlantic Monthly, 2014. It's available online for free. And then a deeper dive would be Sandy Darity's book, co-authored, called From Here to Eternity. And it is a book about the history of reparation struggles and has very specific arguments about what ought to happen now in terms of eligibility and the actual cash payment amount. Second thing, I think that our political marketplace is broken, and I think it's broken in New Jersey. And so we need to change the political costs for ignoring this issue for local, county officials, as well as state officials. And so begin to ask the question of the people that you vote for in local elections and state elections, what their position is, and to hold them accountable and support primary candidates who are willing to say the word reparations and bring these issues forward, along with a number of racial equity issues. I think that's really key in terms of moving the needle. And finally, support the organizations financially and through volunteering that are doing this work on your behalf. Our third sector, our nonprofit sector, our advocacy community dedicates a lot of time and resources. But when we don't show up in support of what they're doing, then we're not helping our own cause. And so if you can't be there to do this work every day, like Andrea is doing and like Solomon is doing and like so many others, then support them financially and give your time when you can.
Great, thank you. And first, you said support candidates. Let's get registered to vote too. So before we go to the audience Q&A, I'd like to just remind everyone that in the Q&A, in the chat, you will find the links you'll find the links to the ISJ report and the 400 years report. Both of them are currently in the chat. There's some other things in the chat too, but check the chat. And also, if you go to the Institute's website, you will find this information as well. So with that, I want to go to the first question from Catherine. And her question is it reasonable to expect that reparations will be implemented on a state-by-state basis? And if so, what happens if it ever gets addressed at the federal level? Andrew, you're shaking your head up and down.
Sure. So, the issue of reparations is definitely nothing new. We know that the promise of 40 acres and a mule made to freed enslaved Africans dating all the way back to 1865 has never been fully realized. The late Representative John Conyers introduced H.R. 40 at the federal level decades ago, and it wasn't until the murder of George Floyd that we were actually able to see that bill come out of committee talking about a reparations task force at the federal level. And so we are, one, excited that that is moving, but we also know that there should be parallel efforts because it happened at the federal level and it happened at the state level, as we've discussed tonight. And so we want to join California. We want to join Evanston, Illinois, which moved it at the municipal level in payment of reparations. And so we encourage everyone, this is really a grassroots effort. We've seen the Trenton City Council. We've seen the Newark City Council, and this week, Montclair City Council issue and pass resolutions calling on New Jersey to create a statewide reparations task force. So something to add on to what you can do, go to your city council and say, pass a resolution calling for a statewide reparations task force. Write letters to the editor calling for a reparations task force. Write op-eds. We have wonderful partner in AIPI Montclair, which recently wrote an op-ed supporting a statewide reparations task force. So there's a bunch that we can do at the state level, the local level, and supporting the federal level to call for reparations in this country.
Right, and that's just really, all we're asking is for a task force at this point. Nobody's even saying give reparations at this point, so it seems like a really small thing to do. Catherine, thank you so much for your question. So this question is directed to you, Dr. Muhammad, and it is your point about broken politics. How do you recommend addressing home rule in New Jersey, persuading local politicians to give up power to allow for implementation of your recommendations? I don't know whether that's a trick question or not. So let's hear what you have to say on that.
Well, I mean, listen, we live in a democracy, right? So we, the people, short of gerrymandering, have the right to decide our fate. And it just seems to me that we can demand more of what we're getting in this in this state. I'm going to say something that I probably shouldn't say, but I think if I'm going to model what matters, I think I should model it. So this is not a local matter. This is my local congressman, Donald Payne, who released an annual report that, for those listening to this call, got it. It's in our kitchen. And half of what he takes credit for is the proposal of legislation that in fact wasn't passed under the Omnibus Infrastructure Bill, which is to say, if he is not educating his own constituents about what we aren't able to do collectively in Congress right now, therefore, at least for those of us who aren't watching the news incessantly, knowing that we have work to do and that we as citizens ought to put pressure on various aspects of federal government or the Democratic Party to achieve these goals, then I'm not sure he's representing us at our best. Instead, he's saying, hey, look, we passed this bill that didn't actually pass Congress and get signed into law. I find that unacceptable. And I just use that as one example. So while I can't tell you in the space of this conversation how to solve the sausage making that exists in New Jersey on this level, I think if all of us were to raise the bar for what we accept from elected officials, we'd have a better state.
Thank you. And I just want to point out that in the chat, there, Dr. Muhammad put in an Atlantic article. So I would, draw your attention to that. So there's another question with regard to how do we overcome the technicality that reparations can only be granted against an illegal action, given that slavery and other discriminatory practices were legal. This is one of the major roadblocks against the ability to execute reparations. It is one of the roadblocks that's been thrown up. I would not call it a valid roadblock. So Solomon, can you start us off with addressing that question?
Yeah, so I think we just have to honestly just have a moment of reflection, right? And know that wrong was done to Black and brown, Black people here in America, right? And that we must make an intentional investment, or at least an intentional, as we're just calling for an advisory panel on reparations, right? Let's have that discussion first, right? And then we can find, the findings as the state would like to say, like, what are the findings from, this reparations committee? That's what we must first do first, right? We're calling for that first. And I think when we do that first, then we can move on to, identifying other factors.
Thank you. And I have a question just to ask all of you very briefly, a question about what you think about universal basic income. Anyone can start. Andrew, you took yourself off mute first, so.
So the Institute actually focuses as one of its policy proposals on guaranteed income, which is a more targeted idea. Universal basic income is, as the name suggests, universal, so everyone's getting a certain amount. In guaranteed income, it's more targeted to address issues such as the racial wealth gap. And so we have a 2021 through 2022 action agenda to make Black Lives Matter in New Jersey available on our website. And one of the policies we're calling for is a statewide guaranteed income program. We also call for it in our new report as a way to close the racial wealth gap by giving specifically communities of color this money to help kind of close that, especially with all the other barriers we face, such as inability to access quality jobs, student loan debt, and other things. And so in addition, we also at the Institute served on the City of Newark's task force that was set up to inform its new pilot guaranteed income program. We know that Patterson is also in the middle of a guaranteed income pilot, and so we're excited to see how these play out, encourage other cities to create their own pilots so that we can inform our outward policy proposal to create a statewide guaranteed income program in the state as well.
Dr. Muhammad, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I just agree with Andrea. I don't think I have anything to add. I mean, the truth is that we're with this particular effort from universal basic income, which I think Andrea makes the appropriate point about targeted focus. We are in a moment of innovation and experimentation, and it's a little bit too early to know what the outcomes would be. Stockton, California is the only place where we have some evidence and the pilot worked, essentially. So this is what is the pickup when it comes to public and private collaborations with philanthropy playing a bit of a role in trying this experimentation out. I think it's all to the good. I just want to also point out two quick things. We essentially underwrote America's white middle class coming out of the Great Depression. And that underwriting lasted until the 1970s with a period of increased inflation or stagflation that essentially eroded much of the social welfare net that had been targeted at white America's working and then middle classes. Wasn't called guaranteed basic income or universal basic income, but when you essentially make homeownership an entitlement through underwriting the cost of homeownership for hundreds of thousands of white Americans, that's a form of asset creation that ultimately the federal government took on. And so this is not uncharted territory, despite what we are calling it today. The other thing I want to point out is to the previous question about legal indemnity and or the lack of a crime being committed when chattel slavery was legal is a very narrow way of thinking about the problem. That's number one. But number two, I'd be just as willing to have an argument about compensation for what happened in the 20th century, which was always extrajudicial and extra legal. The third point is, and I put this in the chat, my colleague, your former president at the Institute, Cornell Brooks, who's now at the Kennedy School, along with Linda Bilmes, who worked in the Clinton administration, have written a paper and have done a couple of events talking about the long established pattern of compensatory compensation or settlements for people harmed by government action. They argue that this is such a common thing that we typically use excise taxes and ask the federal government to collect those taxes, whether they come from the pharmaceutical industry in the form of vaccine creation, or people who are victims of toxins in the environment, or terrorism in the case of the 9/11 Commission. In other words, we have a long established pattern and practice of generating money through taxation for the purposes of distributing to people who have been harmed by some government-related activity. This is not impossible to do.
And Solomon, Mr. Middleton Williams, what would a universal basic income do for your constituency?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We're Newark is a pilot city for UBI. And we've seen the benefits so far from residents. We've had conversations as we go door to door for those who receive, the resources. We're talking about, residents who traditionally don't have, 3 months of savings, right? They now have money to put away for savings. We're talking about residents who will have to choose, paying rent or getting food in their house. They no longer have to make these decisions. And so these are real life factors that factor into the work, especially with our constituents at NCST, where we focus focus on violence, right? And when we know that when you resource communities, we see violence go down, we see healthy communities. And so we've seen the positive benefits of UBI, and we hope that, more cities will do it.
Thank you. This is an interesting question from Jeffrey. Some of the decisions for the types of human capital investment are really tied to the budgeting process. Is any input or suggestions on how residents advocates can help influence that process and get the ear of local state officials to prioritize, balance those with other things like property tax relief? And also he mentions a great book on this subject about equity in tax policy is The Whiteness of Wealth. So for you listeners out there, there's another a book that's been recommended, The Whiteness of Wealth. And so in the meantime, I'm going to start with you, Dr. Muhammad, for this question. Do you want me to say it over again?
I think I got the gist of it.
Okay.
So the author of that book is a scholar at Emory University, a law professor who specializes in tax law. Her name is Dorothy Brown. So my institute at Harvard invited her with Mercer Baradaran, who's written a book called The Color of Money, and the two of them had a great conversation. I'll find that conversation and put it in the chat as well. She makes a basic argument that the tax policy itself further enhances racial wealth disparities by identifying certain family structures and or patterns of white middle class life that ultimately privilege that community. The most obvious of these is the mortgage deduction. And so in a system designed to put white people in homes as a form of asset creation is the same system that benefits them with lesser taxes as property owners. So it's kind of like a double whammy. The other is that a system that was designed ultimately to imagine a white male head of household and a wife who didn't work is a system that created a joint marriage filing system that would essentially treat the white woman as spouse as a dependent. And therefore, there's a penalty, as is the case for joint income earners to file jointly, where essentially the penalty is they don't really get a benefit. They might as well file separately because it was never intended for head of two people as income earners to benefit from a joint filing. Now, again, when you map this on the history and legacy of the destruction of the Black family, then of course, Black people will not benefit as greatly as white families. Now, the good or bad news is that there's tremendous divorce rates in the white community as well. And so this may not be quite the disparity that it once was. But the point is, when you begin to look at the tax policies, you begin to see all the ways in which these fundamental intentional inequalities are reinforced and exacerbated.
Thank you. You just got another question, Andrea, and I'm giving, you can answer that question, but I want to make sure this question goes to you. This next question goes to you, and you may touch on it, in your response, but the question is, so many white people think of reparations as cash out of their pockets, getting past the mentality of win-lose rather than seeking balance and progress toward a win-win solution is a major block in discussions. Real world examples would be very helpful. So you can answer the other question if you want, but I want you to answer this one too.
Sure. Paula, I love this question. I'm going to combine it with the previous one too, because we talk about the money. And so one, to the earlier question, people don't understand budgets. Budgets, especially our budget, is not made to be user friendly. So read the budget, read the governor's detailed budget that comes out, read the line items. Because first I want you to look at what they're doing with the Federal American Rescue Plan funds that we received. How is New Jersey spending that money? We submitted testimony last fall that listed a number of ways we think that money can be spent, including guaranteed income, which I mentioned. But let's be clear. Here in New Jersey, the state always seems to find money for the things it cares about. For example, how many of you on the call knew that the state is currently paying down a $300 million bond document to build 3 new youth prisons at a time where we only incarcerate 100 young people? I often have this conversation with the Institute's president and CEO, Ryan Haygood, about how disingenuous it is to ask, How will we pay for it whenever we bring up racial and social justice issues? Because the way we pay for it is that New Jersey continues to have some of the worst racial disparities in the nation. We pay for it with Black and brown communities struggling to make ends meet. We pay for it with our youth locked up. We pay for it with barriers to democratic participation. In short, it's not up to the communities who have been oppressed by generational divestment to come up with solutions for those who have benefited from that divestment. It's up to those in power, the legislators, the governor, the attorney general, to be responsive to the people. And now that New Jersey is almost 50% people of color, that means the state needs to be responsive to us and our needs. That means the state needs to close our youth prisons and invest $100 million into the communities most impacted by it. The same amount it found to treat the opioid crisis, which we know affects a certain community disproportionately. That means the state needs to refund communities and invest money into community-based violence interrupter programs like the Newark Community Street Team that Solomon does wonderful work with. That means the state needs to invest money into guaranteed income, canceling student loans, investing in election infrastructure. And it permeates this evening's program, reparations, with the first goal being the statewide reparations task force. And again, please visit 400yearsnj.org so we can make that happen today.
Thank you, Andrea. I knew that you were just waiting for that question. So, Mr. Middleton Williams, I want to ask you a question. It's from Andy. Alan Karcher's New Jersey Multiple Municipal Madness tells a tale of local government creation to separate and segregate, and demanding more on the question of home rule and broken politics, machine control. Are there other policy recommendations? As this is actually directed to the Institute's report to address wealth inequity written into local boundaries, even though they're referencing the Institute's report. If you could take the lead on this question.
Yeah, I haven't had the privilege to read the report yet. I know it was just released today, but I will just go back to what Andrea was talking about before. This is really simple. And I said this earlier, that one, we got to just really stop locking up Black and brown people, right? Around, like, if we do that, then we create generational opportunities for generational wealth that would then bridge the gap that we're talking about, this racial disparities. Look, Newark is the home of the second largest port here in the country. However, no Black and brown people can actually work at the port. One, because they have criminal backgrounds, or they don't have the education to do it, or social capital, right? But when we stop locking up people, we at NCST, we found the solution, right? Is that we employ, we train, and we deploy, right? And that solution works, right? So that we can create generational opportunities for generational wealth. And so, again, I haven't read the report. I apologize, Andrea, but I will read it. And the premise of this, if we're really going to bridge the gap, is that we need to stop locking up our people and provide generational opportunities for the generational wealth.
Great, thank you so much. And this question is specifically for you, Dr. Muhammad, and it's kind of a yes or no question, but the question is whether the New Jersey Reparations Task Force bill direct the task force to work on the truth part of the truth and reparations.
You're asking me if it includes a provision to work on the truth part.
Right, and I prefaced it by saying it's a short answer.
Yeah, well, it does, because the process is itself meant to disclose the history that Andrea has described, and to help people who are part of the process and to bear witness to the process to learn those things.
Right. Thank you. There was another question that I don't want to minimize the question, but it's an interesting question, and I would tend to think that we might need a crystal ball to answer it. And the question is, why doesn't Newark have more Black-owned businesses? Don't you all just stare at me like that.
Well, I'll take a quick stab at it. I haven't looked. This is, maybe the 30,000 square foot high answer, but essentially, Black businesses existed in the earlier period, the World War II period, and even before. A lot of Black businesses were destroyed by virtue of eminent domain claims by the state to build highways through our Black communities here. Certainly happened here in New Jersey as well. That's number one. Number two, Black people have always been subjected to predatory practices and or exclusionary practices when it comes to access to capital. And so when you are essentially going to seek a loan, you're subjected to either outright discrimination or subterfuge or corruption at the bank. People might be thinking in contrast, well, then why do these other immigrant populations of color own so many businesses in Black communities? And the answer generally is twofold. One, many of those communities come from places where they're bringing resources to them, where they essentially are bypassing the lending mechanisms, and two, they're pooling family capital. And so those two dynamics can actually make a huge difference if you are essentially owning a family-owned business in this community. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of breaking down the barriers to access to capital. We also have a lot of work to do to protecting the asset creation that Black people actually have, because for too long, when Black people do gain assets, they are often taken advantage of either by violence, by corruption, or other means. I have a graduate student who's literally writing a book on how tax lien policy was used deliberately to remove Black people from their property by overvaluing their property, which increased their taxes, and then selling their property on auction, all of which was deliberately designed to keep Black people out of certain communities.
Paula, can I jump in really quick and answer this from my perspective? I think that we're too busy trying to repair harm that government has done for us, right? We're doing social services program. In Newark, you'll see a lot of nonprofits, right? One, which they're underfunded, but we are currently working to repair the harm that the government should be repairing itself, right? We do have Black businesses in Newark, right? Like Burger Walla downtown, right? We have the Yard, we have Black businesses on Halsey Street, right? At the heart of downtown Newark. But the majority of Newarkers, we are trying to repair the harm that should be done through the federal government and through the state government. That's why there aren't a lot, because we are focusing on saving ourselves.
Thank you for that. I have one final question from our audience. And the question is, has anyone done an analysis of what policies would need to be in place to quantifiably shrink the racial wealth gap in New Jersey within a time certain? What would it take to do that analysis, putting together solutions that include home ownership, debt cancellation, et cetera? And maybe this is a major grantor who's going to fund such a project. So let's hear some good answers on this. There's no name, so I'm wondering whether somebody who's willing to fund such an analysis to do this is asking this question.
Can I yield the floor? So I'm going to yield the floor to either Andrea or Khalil with this one.
Okay. Andrea?
I can lead us off. So please read our newly released report, Making the Two New Jerseys, one where we list several policy proposals to quantifiably shrink the racial wealth gap. So
within a time certain?
There is not a time certain set, but it is as quickly as possible, because these are things that the state can do immediately to begin to close the racial wealth gap. So again, I want to list up those 3 priority policies from our report. 1, making sure that New Jersey establishes a baby bond program. Governor Murphy mentioned that was a priority several years ago. We're still waiting to see that materialize. So you can go to our action center to make sure that you tweet, email, and call your legislators on that. A fair appraisal law to make sure that Black people who continuously have their homes undervalued do not face that kind of racial discrimination in appraisals. You can go to our action center again. And lastly, you can't talk about the racial wealth gap without repairing the harm and the generations of divestment from Black communities. So go again to 400yearsnj.org to support the statewide reparations task force.
Dr. Muhammad.
Yeah, let me just add, I mean, I can't see who's on this call, and I won't venture to guess because I don't know that it matters so much given what I'm about to say. I spend a lot of time in an academic setting where there's a lot of truth telling and there's a lot of research, and yet there might as well be a moat built around this institution when it comes to translating what that means in terms of public action and public priorities and the way the world actually works. So while I'm not discrediting the value of research, we do have a different kind of problem. which is to say that, we need people to take the work that's already done and socialize it in communities across this state. People need to have study groups and listening sessions. They need to take this on themselves. I'll give you by way of historical analogy. In the 1950s and 60s, my colleague Lisa McGurk at Harvard has written a book about this. Some of the strongest resistance to civil rights work happening at that time in places like California, which was considered moderate, but of course it was Ronald Reagan, who was once a liberal governor who became a neoconservative, was to hold these kitchen table conversations around the threat of the federal government and its tax policies as the wedge issue to motivate moderate voters to fight against civil rights. And that sense of taxpayer rights, which became a tax revolt, remains a cornerstone of libertarian and Republican talking points. When they don't want to use the N-word, they can just talk about taxes. And that starts as a grassroots effort around kitchen tables with people socializing these issues. Same thing happened in not repealing, but pushing back against the Equal Rights Amendment. It still isn't passed. It could pass, but it still isn't passed because white women got together who were protectionists, who they wanted the protections of womanhood rather than feminists, and said, we have to stop this amendment in its tracks and refuse these certain states from signing or ratifying this legislation. My point in telling this is, it's not an abstraction about the kind of grassroots organizing work that needs to happen door to door, neighborhood to neighborhood, block to block, in order to see the New Jersey that we want to see. We don't just wait for it to happen, we make it happen. And that's the challenge in closing the gap between the work that the Institute is doing and the work that needs to happen in our communities.
Thank you.
Paula, can I
Yes.
just really quick? I know I heard Khalil say research, right?
Mhm.
And at NCST, we are really keen on research, right? Where for too long, research has been done on Black and brown people, right? And we urge for participatory research, right? Like gone are the days that you're coming into our communities, giving us $10 gift cards and chicken and watermelon, and saying, hey, you're part of it, right? What we're asking for, if we really want to bridge this wealth gap, right? Put our names as experts on these reports, right? So that we can earn the same income possibly, right, as white men are earning on these reports. So they come in our communities and extract genius from Black and brown communities, and then they make millions and leave us, right? Allow us to be on those reports so that we can, show our genius and so that we can earn a great income.
Great, thank you. So, it's kind of time for us to wrap up this brilliant conversation. I could listen to the three of you the rest of the night and into tomorrow, but they're telling me that we have to go. But I just want to raise up and remind our audience of some of the key points that you raised this evening. And, if we have time, if I missed something, please let me know. But I took some notes. And, I really like that last point that you made, Mr. Middleton Williams, about extracting genius from our communities and then using it for their own benefit, sort of like the Henrietta Lacks situation. So I want us to keep that in mind and think about ways that we can ensure that we don't just get used for the benefit of others. And then, the tax being the cornerstone of racism and how that process has evolved. And thinking about what we can do, Andrew, what you said about how we find money to spend on what it is we want to spend it on, and how our communities, the Black and brown communities and the generally underserved communities are left out. That when they want to find money to do something, it can be found. For example, like the opioid crisis, no one found money for the crack crisis, did they? So it is of a very similar situation. And I'm not really a panelist, but sometimes I get a little carried away. And then I think about how you talked about, Dr. Muhammad, how the Black white middle class was created with government resources when it should have been for everyone, not just for to create benefits for white people. But that has been the case with regard to a number of laws that have been passed, like the Civil Rights Act, how it didn't benefit us as much as it did really some white women. And, I'm not taking anything from white women, but we have to look at the laws that are created ostensibly because we have been underserved and underrepresented, and how so many others benefit from it. And then I just want to get back to what some of the really solid policy solutions and things that we can do. One is promote the baby bond program. And I say, let's put a date on it. Let's say we want this done by X date. And then the fair appraisal law, which is really critical. We shouldn't have to, among other things, take all our Black art off the walls before anybody comes in to try to buy a house. And then, Andrea, say the word. Reparations is not a new word. It's a word that we've heard for years in context with regard to other people. Other people have received reparations. Why is it such a bad word when we talk about it? And then we want to invest in community safety, decriminalize drugs, and have equal other affordable opportunities that you addressed, Mr. Middleton Williams. And then, truth and reparations, that came up twice in the conversations, first by you, and then someone asked whether it's really a part of the task force that we're talking about creating. And then a constitutional amendment regarding teaching, sort of disrupt what some of the other states are doing the reverse of what they're doing, making sure that everybody has a complete history, not just during Black History Month that we're in now, the shortest month of the year, but all times incorporate, show the contributions. And then education and housing and zoning, Dr. Muhammad and Mr. Middleton Williams, you gave us some bonus questions or some bonus solutions. So I hope that a lot of you have been taking notes like I have. There have been a number of links placed in the chat that I would commend to all of our reading, and just cut and paste it, and put it somewhere. But it has been, such a worthy conversation, and I can't begin to thank you enough. The conversation has to go on because, Andrew, you said a very good point. We have to educate ourselves, and just because, as you pointed out, Dr. Muhammad, that just because somebody looks like us doesn't mean that they're providing us with the best education. So we have to carefully examine, who it is that we listen to, who it is that we take advice from, and get the facts for ourselves so we can adequately advocate for what will bring us equity and justice in New Jersey. And with that, I would like to, I've gotten carried away. I know I'm off script, but I want to thank all of you. And I think that it's really time for me to turn it back over to Kiki Jameson. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Kiki, for allowing me this opportunity to moderate these fabulous panelists.
Thank you, Paulette. And thank you, Andrea, Khalil, and Solomon. This was really a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I keep thinking about what you said, Professor Muhammad, that we don't just wait for it to happen, we make it happen. And I'd like to thank all of our partners and co-sponsors without whom this event wouldn't have been possible. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. We'll be following up next week with a recording of this event, as well as an extensive list of resources, including things that were listed in the chat. So if you didn't get everything down, don't worry about it. We'll provide a lot of additional information for you. I also hope that you'll join us for the next installment of Imagine More, Racial Justice Begins With Us. We'll be gathering again together on March 15th to talk about disrupting the criminal justice system. More information about that event and the 4 that will follow after that can be found on the website www.imaginemorenj.org. Thank you very much for spending your time with us tonight. Have a great evening.